In this photo, Elisabeth Volkenrath, she was only 26 years old when she was executed on December 13, 1945 by Albert Pierpoynat, the famous English executioner. At her trial, she will claim that she was forced to slap the women in the face because they tried to steal bread that did not belong to them. She was one of the few representatives of her gloomy profession who had to pay the bills. Probably if she had shown a little less zeal in her terrible craft, this lady, like most of her colleagues, would have quietly lived to an old age. But fate did not give her such an opportunity, leading to a natural ending. That's the kind of person we're going to talk about today. Elisabeth Volkenrath, one of the 6 children of Forester Josef Mulau and his wife, was born on September 5, 1919 in Schönau an der Katzbach, at that time part of the Weimar Republic, which was the government of Germany from 1918 to 1933. In January 1933, when Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party came to power, Elisabeth was only 13 years old. Soon after, she became a member of the League of German Girls, which was the women's section of the Hitler Youth. These organizations, led by Baldur von Schirach, were the main tools that the Nazis used to familiarize young people with Nazi ideology, thus shaping the beliefs, thinking, and actions of German youth. In January 1933, the Hitler Youth had about 100,000 members, but by the end of the year, this figure had increased to more than 2 million. Jews were not allowed to join these organizations. In 1941, Volkenrath was drafted into the SS and sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she trained as a guard. The authorities attracted potential candidates for the position of executioner with a very substantial salary of 105 Reichsmarks. In addition, substantial overtime allowances were provided, which could reach 35 Reichsmarks per month. The women who successfully passed the selection were supposed to be provided with underwear, although not in full. And finally, the most tempting condition was the promise. With due diligence and appropriate abilities, the opportunity opens up to take the post of head of one of the outer camps of the concentration camp. Ravensbrück camp, which was opened in May 1939, became the only major women's camp organized by the Nazis. In total, about 132,000 women from all over the continent passed through it, including Poles, Russians, Jews, Gypsies, and others. Of this number, more than 92,000 women died in terrible conditions. In March 1942, Volkenrath was transferred to the Auschwitz concentration camp, located in occupied Poland. The transfer to the concentration camp was a turning point in the life of Elisabeth Volkenrath. It was there that she met her future husband, SS Rotenführer Heinz Volkenrath. Her chosen one began his service as a simple block Führer, keeping order in the barracks, but by that time he had already risen to the head of the detachment. Curiously, the emerging romantic feelings may have prompted Elisabeth to treat the prisoners with more gentleness and loyalty. This was told in particular by former prisoner Heather Morris. Inspired by love, the warden working at the post office, where she led a group of 25 to 30 prisoners, allowed prisoners to share food parcels among themselves, which arrived in the name of already deceased comrades in misfortune. She hummed songs, hummed to herself, and literally beamed with happiness during her lover's visits. The most striking episode was when Elisabeth Volkenrath even protected one of the girls from the wrath of her harsh husband. The prisoner, having found yesterday's newspaper, simply threw it into the oven. Just a couple of minutes later, Heinz Volkenrath appeared at the post office, looking for the missing person. Upon learning that the newspaper had long since turned to ashes, the officer put a pistol to the unfortunate culprit's head. But to the amazement of everyone present, Elisabeth Volkenrath suddenly stood up for the girl. Contrary to expectations, she praised the prisoner for maintaining order and neatness. This episode is the only documented one during Elisabeth's entire career. She was then assigned to a sewing workshop where prisoners repaired clothes for their cellmates. Among those who worked in the workshop, there were many elderly women whom Volkenrath beat, often with her fists, so hard that they fell to the ground. She would later claim that she was forced to slap them in the face because they were trying to steal bread that did not belong to them. Elisabeth Volkenrath was also responsible for distributing bread to the prisoners, which took place in the same office. The heads of all the blocks came with 1 or 2 other prisoners and took bread for their block. Elisabeth Volkenrath, one of the most brutal concentration camp guards, found special pleasure in senseless beatings of prisoners for any trivial reason. It was enough to glance carelessly, tilt her head incorrectly, or walk too slowly, or, conversely, quickly, and any prisoner who caught her eye became a target for her. In addition, Volkenrath, with undisguised pleasure, personally selected those unfortunate people who were destined to meet their last hour in the gas chamber. She even brought her own monstrous innovations to the process of sending those doomed to death. Being a fan of classical music, this former laborer probably reveled in how the condemned marched towards their terrible fate to the sounds of divine melodies. Many survivors of the camp after the war recalled with a shudder that they always associated the image of the senior matron with the masterpieces of great composers. Volkenrath's constant companion was a rubber baton, which became the main instrument of torture in the hands of this inhuman woman. She did not part with her tool for a minute, constantly keeping it ready. On January 18, 1945, when Soviet troops approached the Auschwitz concentration camp complex, Elisabeth Volkenrath left the camp. At this time, the SS began evacuating Auschwitz and its auxiliary camps. These prisoner evacuations, known as death marches, were horrific marches where prisoners had to travel long distances under guard, in extremely difficult conditions, resulting in numerous casualties among them. On February 5, 1945, Volkenrath arrived at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The sanitary conditions in the Bergen-Belsen camp were terrible. There was no water for washing, and what was there was barely enough for drinking and cooking. Between January and March 1945, when prisoners from other concentration camps began to be sent on death marches, about a third of those who arrived in transports were already doomed. Almost 80% of those who remained were so weak and sick that they had to be picked up from the station by trucks because they could not walk. In one case, out of 1,900 prisoners, more than 500 were delivered dead. The prisoners received almost no food during these marches, and when they arrived at the camp, there was no food either. The camp was so crowded that during the winter months, when it was very cold, prisoners had to sleep sitting on the floor, trying to cover themselves with only 200 blankets, while tens of thousands of people were in the camp. Due to hunger, thirst, and outbreaks of typhus epidemics, the average daily death rate among prisoners ranged from 250 to 300 people. However, sooner or later, any story comes to an end. Elisabeth Volkenrath was no exception. In April 1945, she found herself in the hands of British troops. Amazingly, during the court hearings, Elisabeth Volkenrath even confused the judge with her extraordinary directness. Vera Fischer, a former prisoner of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, testified. She informed the court as follows. In July 1942, at Auschwitz, Volkenrath was the senior unit officer in the infirmary. Once I had very severe pain, I couldn't even straighten up and stand straight. She beat me with such brutality that after that I had to spend 3 weeks in the infirmary. Major Monroe, who was taking statements from the former supervisor, naturally asked the defendant to comment on this episode. Mrs. Vera Fischer claims that the beatings on your part were so severe that she had to spend 3 weeks in the infirmary. To this, Volkenrath replied that what was said was completely untrue. Moreover, during the entire process, the former warden categorically denied the charges against her, insisting that the conditions in the camp, although strict, were nothing more. The tragedy of Elisabeth Volkenrath's personality is that she was probably an ordinary person who gradually adapted to a monstrous system where violence became the norm. Her excuses, they tried to steal bread, demonstrate the mechanism of moral decay when cruelty begins to be taken for granted. Friends, that's what the video turned out to be. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, put likes, and write comments.